Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started on a lecture on JavaScript functions. And we'll start off, I don't know why, what I need to do is have Emmet, my Emmet abbreviation, fill in a Bootstrap starter template. But just get these basic wiring things taken care of, and then we'll kind of pick it up from there. So JavaScript functions, why are they important, and what's going on? Well, what is a JavaScript function? A function is a block of code that can be called. And so it's just a block of code that you can call once or you can call 100 times. The benefit of a function is code reuse. And the idea is that you write the code one time, and once it's tested and it works well, you could call it any time you need it. And so, you kind of wrap functionality and logic into, you wrap your logic and behaviors into a function, and then once it's tested and it works well, then you just have to call the function to execute a lot of behaviors. And so that's why we use functions. We use functions so we don't have to type the same code over and over again. In fact, we can write it once, put it in an external script file, and then let other people use our functions. A lot of JavaScript libraries that we will use in the future, are just a bunch of pre-written JavaScript, a bunch of pre-written functions that we could just take advantage of. So code reusability is a major benefit of writing functions. Now, again, if a function is a code block, meaning it's just just basically between a couple of curly braces. This is a code block in between curly braces. Well, we're going to give our function a name, so this is a keyword function, and I'll call my function do something. And notice it has parentheses, and so this is kind of the basic, if I spell it right, this is the basic syntax of creating a function. Okay, now do something is defined but never used. And so what it's saying is we need to, here, this is called a function declaration. And a function declaration means create the function, right? We are creating the function to be called at a later time. Creating the function. And our function, could do whatever it needs to do. We can wrap whatever logic is needed can go between the curlies. New line required. Okay. So there's really two parts of working with functions. First, you have to create the function, as we've done here, and you have to call the function. And so in order to call the function, we'll just put a little button click in here and call that function. Now, button, type of button, call this button do work. And so we'll go ahead and wire up our do work on click equals so this is an example of calling the function. Now you'll notice we have a function right here. This arrow function doesn't have a name. It's an anonymous function. Okay, so we're wiring up an event, the click event of our button that runs an anonymous function. That anonymous function, this is your function call. Line 13 is referred to as a function call. So we create the function and we call the function. Now whatever do something will do, we will do something very simple like function was called, and just demonstrate a class button success. Okay, so I've demonstrated declaring a function and calling a function in its most basic forms. So kind of the first thing to understand is that working with functions, why do we work with them? Well, it allows a lot of benefits through the reuse of code. How to work with the functions? Well, we have to declare the function first and we have to call the function second. And then the next thing to understand about functions can take inputs and outputs. In other words, you can send data into the function and the function can return something out of the function. And so the way this is done, so for the inputs, a function can take 0 or more parameters. Okay, what a parameter is a variable that is used in the function and declared in the parentheses. Okay, so here in between this do something, notice that there's no variables in here. I've not declared any variables in here. So I say you declare a variable, you might think I need to put the keyword like let data. Actually, when you declare a parameter, you don't have to put the keyword let or const. This is actually declaring a variable, and that variable is called data. And let's go ahead and put in the function was called with the param of, and then I'll just put in data right there. So now this function is called do something. And sometimes in order for a function to work properly, you need to give it some inputs. You need to give it some data. Like if you have a function called add, well, what are we adding? What numbers are we adding? So functions take optional inputs. Now keep in mind these are optional. I did have this method called do something that did not take any inputs at first, but now it does have one input. So in order to call this function, I need to pass it something. So here, the function call, when I add parameters, you have to call that function differently now. This function is expecting a piece of data. So this number 5 will be passed into this variable called data. and then it will be logged to the console, right? So this variable right here is called a parameter. It's declared in between these parentheses. These are optional. You don't have to have them. You could have 0 or many of them. It turns out you could have like 10 of them if you wanted to. Okay. And that's how you input, that's how you send data into the method. Now, if I run it now, you could say the function was called, the param is 5. I would say the param value is 5. And I could call do something. I could call do something repetitively, like, right? And I could pass it a name. And because of the way that variables work, I could pass it an array. Like let's just pass it like a new array. Here, let's do this. I'll pass it the numbers array and bool. So here I'm calling the do something function, passing it all sorts of, giving it all sorts of inputs, and each time it didn't like my bool, but otherwise it got 5, my name, 1, 2, 3, 4. It says bool is not defined. Oh, I was going to say false. There we go. Okay, so this data is a variable. Now notice if I, data, the scope of this, in other words, where data can be used is only in this function. So data is a parameter, and you can only work with this parameter inside of the function. That's kind of the nature of parameters. They're only used inside of their functions. If I were to kind of come down here and do a console.log with data, my editor is going to say out of scope. Data is not defined. And of course, if I were to try to run it, it's probably going to crash. Data is not defined. So that's an input. Now, if I add another parameter, we do that with separating it with commas. Then I need to pass it two values here. I'll pass it, I don't know, numbers twice, and I'll pass it true. So it is true that the number of parameters has to match in the function call. And so if there's 2 inputs, when you call the method, you need to pass it 2 values separated by commas. And so you've got, now it's using both parameters in the output. So a function can have 0 or many inputs. For the inputs, a function can take 0 or more parameters. Parameter is a variable that is used in the function and is declared in parentheses. Now for the outputs, a function can return 0 or 1 piece of data. And that piece of data could be an array, but basically the return, this is done with the optional return keyword. So a function does not have to return anything. I think of it like this. So I think of, I'll just make up another example here. Okay, so I'm going to delete my inputs. I'm going to make a function called walk. Okay, so it's going to represent taking some steps. Maybe a person walking, right? So we declare the function, and we call the function, and let steps equals document.getElementById miles.value. So we're going to read a text box. We're going to ask the user enter a number of miles, text miles, button do work. So now I'm going to read the steps from the miles text box. I'll put this miles, and then I don't know how many steps are in a mile. So how many steps are in a mile? 2,000 steps. Okay, so roughly 2,000 steps depending on what have you. So let's make a let number steps equals miles times 2,000. And now we're going to represent all of our steps. So we're going to loop through our So we're going to cause the behavior to happen. Now, you know, in my simple example for each step, let's do a normal for loop, just making this up as I go, console.log walking ... And so for every step, it's just going to output to the log walking. Okay, so this is a demonstration of, hey, it's not a demonstration of much, but I'm going to get there. So if I say enter a number of miles 1, and I say do work, I can't read the value of null. So what that means is my miles does not match text miles. So now they match. If I say 1, you could see the number counted up. I don't know if you saw that very quickly, but you can just see kind of it's just scrolling up real quick, walking. Okay, so I took 2,000 steps. That's representative of doing something, like the function did something. It caused this output to occur, this action to occur. And you might want to use that number. So the point is, we have this number of steps. Let's say there's a condition in here. If user faints is true, then you break out of the for loop, right? User faints is a Boolean. User faints is we're going to say it's false. And maybe there's a condition in here that turns it to true. So let's do this. If number of steps is greater than 2 miles, so 4,000, then we're going to set user faints equals to true. Okay? And so user feints to true. If user feints is true, then we are going to return number of steps that they took. We'll give them a triple equal sign. Hey, Al.
Hey.
What's going on? Okay, so this is just kind of this weird example, but basically if you end up walking more than 2 miles and you faint, and if you faint, you're going to return the number of steps that they took. And that's inside the loop. Otherwise, now, so there's a condition in here that anytime, by the way, anytime you hit the return keyword, you are done with the function. It's essentially the function is done executing. So if the user feints basically on the 4001st step, it's going to return 4001. Otherwise, it's going to return however many steps they took. So it should work for 1 mile and 2 miles. It should return 2,000 and 4,000 steps. Anything more than 2 miles, they're going to feint, and it's going to return the number of steps, basically 4001. So now I've got this function, and this function is going to return one piece of data. Now it could return, you know, you notice there's multiple return keywords, and depending on the conditions, what have you. But so what do we do with that? Well, walk can be assigned to a variable. I'll say let steps taken equals, and then let's, at the very end of this, I'll just do an alert just to show you that this is the only alert. It's going to be an alert pop-up for the steps taken. So what happens here is that our function returns a piece of information to the calling function. What is the calling function? The calling function is this anonymous click event right here. So walk is called, and walk is going to return some number into this variable, and then we can pop up that variable. That's kind of a more explanation maybe than is needed, but so if I do work, you notice 2000 pops up. So 2000 was the number returned out of the walk function. 4000, notice if I do work, okay. So 6000, so something in my logic didn't work. I don't need a break keyword. It should just return. Okay, user feints is true. User feints is false. If user feints is true, return number of steps. That should break as soon as number of steps goes above 4000. And 3 miles. I'm going to start off at number of steps, miles. Oh. Number of steps. If I start number of steps off is a calculation right here. My number of steps is 6,000 immediately, and then it just, okay, so that's the flaw in my logic. I don't increase steps by 1 at a time through the for loop. You could do that by just representing. I could hack this into being what it needs to be. Is that important at this point? Are you guys following along, or did I lose you? Following along, George? Yeah. Amel and John, are you guys following along, or did I lose you?
I think I understand what you're getting at.
Okay. If I change this, yeah, if I change this index, if I change this to be index, if the index is more than 4,000, user faces true, and then I could just go ahead and set number of steps equals like 4001. You're always going to pass out at 4001. Again, I could hack it to being, I think, what it needs to be. So there you go. So I could hack it to be what it needs to be. The important thing to take away when you create a function, it has inputs and outputs. The inputs are parameters, and the output is the optional return keyword. And sometimes functions can have multiple return keywords, but as soon as it hits one return keyword, the function is done executing. Like the function is done once it hits a return. So it's either going to run this return or this return, but keep in mind, like, you don't even necessarily need to return anything. If you just want the behavior to happen, I'm like, we don't even need, remember, this is kind of how we started our function. We started our function without having a keyword at all, a return at all. And that function just caused behavior to happen, and we were fine with that. But if you want to send data to a function, it's sent in parameters. If you want to return information back to the calling function, it's done with the return keyword. Now, the textbook is going to kind of go into this creating a function with an identifier. The name of the function is a $sign. So this is the name of the function. I'm not going to recommend using that, so I'm not going to ever code this $sign function. It is a shorthand for writing a document query selector. But again, the reason I don't like this is because I've worked with JavaScript. I've worked with jQuery. jQuery uses a $sign selector. And so when we write our own $sign function, the function that we write conflicts with the jQuery $sign function, and it conflicts. So I don't like this $sign function. So it's basically what this is, again, is a shorthand for writing some code. I'm just not going to use it because it causes a conflict with jQuery. This is an example of a function with two inputs and one output. Right? Pretty straightforward. When you call the function, you pass it two inputs, and it returns a value, so we can restore what goes on the left of the equal sign is the result of this calculation. So this variable would store the result of this calculation, or 425. Hey, Theo. Okay. JavaScript has, if I go back to the JavaScript Wikipedia, I said there was a term I'm going to come back to. And if you remember from our last lecture, we said JavaScript is dynamic typing, prototype-based, object-oriented, with first-class functions. So let's click on first-class functions. This was new to me when I was getting into JavaScript. And if you did other object-oriented languages, this will be new to you as well. In computer science, a programming language is said to have first-class functions if it treats its functions as first-class citizens. Okay, that's kind of a funny term. First-class citizen. This means, and goes deeper, this means that the language supports passing functions as arguments to other functions. That sentence right there. This means you can pass a function as an argument to another function. Now, what does that mean? Well, keep in mind, we call this a parameter, data. When I say 5, 5 is referred to as an argument. 5 is the data that gets sent into the parameter. So this is a language difference between an argument, 5 is an argument, 5 is sent into the parameter data. So data equals 5. But it's just a subtle difference. Argument versus parameter. So we can pass a function into a variable, into a parameter. Okay, we're not going to do that right away. We will do that later on, and we'll kind of see where that is useful. Okay, but let's continue. Return them as values from other functions, and so just like we can send we can send a function into a function, we can return a function out of a function. Okay, and this is the key part where I'm going to highlight this. And assign them to variables. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. We can assign a function to a variable. That was weird to me, and this is new to me. And so when you see the syntax here, we're going to create a variable, and we're going to assign that variable equal to a function. And it's just a weird, different syntax. I don't like it because I'm not as comfortable with it. Now, I understand it. I use it. It's just not my comfort zone. This is my comfort zone because I come from an object-oriented background where this is how we created functions. But some languages might not create functions this way. JavaScript is a language where you can create functions in different ways, right? So I'm going to make another function using this syntax. It's a different syntax. Notice here we're creating a variable, assigning it equal to a function with parameters or without parameters. So I'm just I'll do exactly what they do in the book. Constant show year, this is a variable, equal to a function. Now this function has no parameters. And we'll do let year equals new date. Alert year dot get full year. So this is another syntax. This is what is called a function declaration. See this? This is called a function declaration. This syntax for creating a function is called a function expression. Just another syntax for creating a function. If you're like me, this is weird, but it's a thing. Now to call this, I'm not going to call walk, I'm just going to call show year like that. Not to make too big of a deal out of it. There you go. It's just another syntax for creating a function. The reason we can do that is because in JavaScript, we treat functions as first-class citizens. We treat functions as first-class citizens, which just means we can do these kinds of things with functions. We can pass functions to functions. We can return functions from functions. And we can assign functions equal to variables. That's what it means to be a first-class citizen in a programming language. Did you know there were citizens in programming languages? You do now. It's weird, but it is what it is. Now, keep in mind there can be parameters. So if I were to say something like, here's my show year, here's my function, I could put my parameter in here, and now when I show the year and pass it the number 5, we'll say we'll do something like, the parameter value is data, and the year is okay. I think I got that closed up properly. There you go. That's how you pass a parameter into a function that was declared with this function expression syntax. Okay, and it's the same thing for multiple, and this is an example on how a function expression can take multiple inputs. Now this right here is what we just learned on how to create a function expression with multiple parameters. There is a way to condense that down using an arrow function. Notice we got the keyword function here. And when we do an arrow function, we could say this is the same, the name of our function equals, and then notice we dropped the keyword function and then just replaced it with an arrow. So it's really not a big benefit there. I mean, literally, you're dropping one keyword and replacing it with an arrow. Otherwise, the syntax is the same. For an arrow function written in this kind of like a function expression, kind of a combination of the two. Now, it does get a little bit more condensed if you only have one parameter. Notice what have we dropped here? On this one, we've dropped the keyword function and we've dropped the parentheses. So this is a function called calculate tax that takes one parameter, and whenever you call it, it does as such. Now notice here on this next one, if your function only has one statement, this function right here, this function has two statements. Okay, this function has two statements. Notice what happens if I condense it down into one statement. If I condense it down into one statement, I don't need the curlies anymore. So what have we dropped? We've dropped the parentheses, we've dropped the keyword function, and we've dropped the curlies. So we are really, so what is this arrow function doing? It is really allowing us to condense down our code and like write it more efficiently. The MDN article on arrow functions is a must read for anyone going through this JavaScript class for the first time. because it goes through. Now this is an anonymous function, meaning a function without a name. And it talks about exactly this. It talks about the benefits of an arrow function. Because here we drop the keyword function, right? And we replace it with an arrow. We drop the keyword return because it's just returning a single statement. And because there's only a single parenthesis, we can remove the argument parentheses. So it does this article, when you read through, it does a really good job of explaining exactly what I'm going through here, which is how the arrow function can be used to condense your code down very efficiently. So here's a function called getCurrentURL that takes no inputs and returns a document location href, which is going to be the URL of that page. So this function, anytime you call this function, it returns the URL of the page. So this is an example of calling that arrow function. Okay, now arrow functions were introduced within the last, 10 years. I don't know exactly what version of JavaScript arrow functions were. Arrow function expression is a compact alternative to a traditional function expression. We just learned what a function expression is, but is limited and can't be used in all situations, right? Particularly if you have a lot of lines of code. It's good. Arrow functions are really good at just returning a single thing. Like, here's your input and return this piece of thing. Return this data. Okay. So these are your function basics. The first thing to get familiar with is the function declaration. The second thing to get familiar with is a function expression. The third thing to get familiar with is the arrow function. PowerPoint. So I want to do an arrow function because I did do an example of these two. I'll make a function called add equals one input num arrow, and then I'm just going to return num plus num. So now I'm going to call an alert. I'll call add, pass it the value of 3. Right? And that's just a quick demonstration of an arrow function. This arrow function is stored in a variable called add, which allows us to call it by that variable identifier. maybe we would call it double. Okay, last couple of slides. As you are going through this class, we've been doing some tutorials with Free Code Camp, and we've already kind of covered these basics in Free Code Camp. The difference between global variables and local variables. So if a variable, let's talk about various scopes. Global scope. So if we say let data or name Evan. Okay, this variable is global, meaning I can work with it in any of these functions, and like let's even kind of go here. As we start having multiple script tags, it was declared here. Now we've got script 2, and I should be able to plop that into here. Here's my name, here's script 2, alerts name, and there you see it is global in nature, and even my various scripts can refer to global variables. So even though the name variable wasn't defined in that script, other scripts can use it. And so that's exactly what global scope means. Now local scope are variables that are declared inside of a function. Okay, that means that I cannot use this variable anywhere else besides this walk function. And so even if I try and go down here and say alert age inside of this show year, well, it's going to tell me in my linter, in my ES linter, that age is not defined. Whereas if I were to do alert age here, excuse me, outside of quotes, like it's local scope, so it's accessible in this function. It's not accessible in any other function. It's not accessible here, there, or anywhere else besides this walk function. Turns out this parameter scope is just like my local scope. Okay, parameter variables and local variables are accessible inside the function of which they're declared. So, I mean, that's the big thing. Before we, now use strict is common. You should always use strict. And we're not going to be using like the keyword var anymore. Like that's old JavaScript. Now we use let and const instead. But there were some holes that would accidentally create global variables inside of like this. Like notice I didn't declare age at all. If I didn't use strict, this is not going to work. But this actually used to work, and what it would do would be it would create a global variable called age, and that would create all sorts of conflicting issues. Because as you saw, if I have another script over here, and I wanted to create an age here, well now this age and then this age would be conflicting and causing problems. So long story short, we don't want to do that. All of our variables should be declared with let or const. If you're going to reassign the variable, use let. If you're not going to reassign the variable, use const. And that's the difference between global scope and local scope. The last thing to mention is you could have this, even though this is not good practice. So what am I doing here? I got this function called walk. I'm going to go ahead and call the walk function. Okay, on my button click, I call walk, And notice I've got a local variable conflicting with a global variable. They have the same name. And my linter is telling me it's probably a bad idea. Notice, okay, let me take out my script too, because that don't need it right now. So now I'm just linking to my script. And so when I load the page and I click the button, it prints out Gudmested. So what it does is it makes the local variable inside of the function be the variable that it uses. If you use name outside, like maybe down here, right? So if I call show year, instead of calling walk, show year, pass it to number 4, that's not really being used. Then we're going to see that it uses the global variable, which is Evan, instead. Right, so that's the gist of scope. We got global scope, we've got local scope. Parameters basically have local scope. And if you have a global scope conflicting with local scope, the local scope will take precedence in the method. The global scope will take precedence outside of the method. But the best practice is to not make conflicting variable names. Give them different names. It's also worth noting that when you have a for loop, like this, notice we're creating a variable here called index. This index, its scope is basically inside of this for loop. You cannot use this variable index outside of this for loop. It is out of scope. So here we're declaring a for loop and a block of code for that for loop that its scope is only in that for loop. It's really not that complicated. You know, variables declared inside of a block of code are accessible inside of that block of code. If you have a variable declared outside of the block of code, it's global. And that's the summary of it. All right. I thought that was the last topic, but I'm wrong. There's just a couple more topics. And that is dealing with events, okay? And these are not going to be all that difficult, but I'm going to go ahead and take a short break, and we'll come back and hit events. And again, I don't think this will take too long. Okay, so a couple of terms I want to define as we resume here is an event and an event handler. Slight difference between an event is something quote unquote interesting happens. And boy, that's generic, and that's how a lot of these things tend to be. That could be the user hovers over an image. That could be the user presses the enter key. That could be the user clicks on a button. That could be the user tabs off of a control on a form. That could be a certain keystroke combination on the keyboard. Like, it's very vague. But it's the occurrence. The occurrence. Something happens. Something occurred. An event handler is a method that happens in response to an event. Okay, so an event is one thing versus an event handler is kind of something else. We've been writing event handlers. We've been writing event handlers like this. Document, get element by ID, button, what's our button called? Do work. On click equals, here comes your arrow function, and this is an anonymous arrow function. Now, some arrow functions, as we just demonstrated, you can give you can have functions that are named, and you can have anonymous functions that don't have names. So this is an anonymous arrow function. This is how we've been wiring up event handlers. Turns out there's another way that's slightly better than this, and it's just not quite as easy, but it does offer an advantage. There's an add event listener method. Click, and here's, if we had a named function, and then we put do work right in here like this. Now, you might be saying, what? Why? How is this any better? And just let me show you that this is another way of wiring up an event listener. And you could see every time I click the button, the number goes up. So we're calling that function every time. Well, the benefit of add event listener is that there's also a remove event listener. And so kind of the advantage here of using this syntax is that not only can we add an event listener, but we can also remove an event listener. What that allows you to do is just have one button. And in some scenarios, this button can call one function, and in another scenario, dynamically, this function could call another function. And so it allows you to add and remove event listeners to events. The event is, whether it's the click or the double click, I kind of skipped over the events. Clicks and double clicks and mouse overs and mouse ins and mouse outs. When a control receives focus, when a control loses focus, or a blur, when a control changes, like a text box changes. So we could do something like a text box, which is text miles, and we could say document get element by ID text miles dot add event listener change. We're going to call do work, and it's really interesting because you're not actually calling this function. You're just wiring up an event listener. You're saying when the change event occurs, then you call do work. That's why you actually don't put parentheses right here. So now, whenever I change the text box, you can see do work was called when I tabbed off. So here, every time it's changed, it's calling that function. Again, that's the theory behind why you would use add event listener versus, and this is how you would call a named function. It turns out you could also do something like this. And make sure my parentheses line up here. I might have one extra parenthesis. If you don't even want to, this is kind of another way of doing the exact same thing that we've been doing. Again, now at this point we don't even need, we're not calling the function do work, the named function. We're saying on the change event, run this anonymous arrow function, kind of going back to what we were doing before. And just to demonstrate that works, there it goes. So again, the event, these are events that can happen to form controls. These are events that can happen to any HTML element. So you can click a paragraph, you can double click a paragraph, you can mouse over an image, you can mouse out of an unordered list. There is an event called DOM content loaded, and in short, I used to have to write this event called content loaded, and the defer attribute basically made it so we don't have to do this anymore. We used to have to wait for all of the HTML to download and parse before we ran any JavaScript. And in order to do that, we would wait for this event to happen, DOM content loaded. But if you kind of look at the video that I posted in Discord about the defer attribute and how it works, we don't have to really do this anymore. So that's actually quite nice. So that's DOM content loaded, not necessary because we use the defer attribute. Kind of the same thing. If you just wanted to wait for the browser window to load, you could do, there's also unload events. So as a browser is closing, there are all sorts of other events. These are just common events, typically clicking and that kind of thing. Add event listener is another way to wire up events besides what we're used to. It does offer the slight benefit of being able to remove an event listener. So sometimes you click the button, you call this function, other times you call that function, depending on how the user is interacting with the page. And finally, the last thing on here deals with controls that have some default behaviors. So let's go ahead and wire up like an anchor tag. This tag will say page 2, and let's just make a page2.html. Title is page 2, and heading is page 2. And so you click the link and you navigate to page2.html, and of course that's how it works. And let's go ahead and give our anchor tag an ID of nav page 2. I don't know, nav page 2. And so instead of directly navigating to page 2, you might see this on some websites. Are you 18 years older? You know, fill out this survey to make sure that you're, you know, fill out these prerequisites to be able to visit to the page that allows you to buy alcohol or whatever. You got to be 21 and up to buy alcohol. So scan your driver's license, and only if the JavaScript says that you have a valid ID can you navigate to the page to buy alcohol. Making up a scenario, but you get the idea, and this is how you could use JavaScript to do something like that. So let's go ahead and document get element by ID. What do we call it? Nav page 2. Add event listener. Click, comma, and in here I'm going to put a single event object. And this comes with a function called prevent default. And so this should stop our page from navigating to page 2. If I did it right, and I don't do this every day, so let's see. Okay, you can see we are no longer navigating to page 2. And we're going to scan the ID. In other words, in this case, we're just going to ask the user their age. Prompt, enter your age. Let age equals, if age greater than or equal to 21, navigate to page 2. Else alert. I'm going to be funny here. Go home, nerd. Ha ha ha. Okay. We're asking the user for their age. We stopped the default. Remember I said the navigator, JavaScript to navigate to URL. And here's the window location href. We kind of did this earlier today. Window location href is page2.html. Excuse me. And so here we're clicking the link. It'll pop up, ask them for their age, navigate if they're 21 or older, otherwise tell them to go home. Enter your age, 22. We notice we navigate to page 2. Page 2, you're 12, go home. Ha ha ha, fun times. That's how you can use the event object to cancel a default behavior. Now you might say, okay, well that's one use case, but you could also say submit buttons. Submit buttons have default events. And you might want to cancel the submit button from submitting the form if there are validation errors. And so that's a very real world common use case where you would want to cancel or prevent the default behavior. You know, you don't want to submit the form if there are validation errors. And so that's another, these are all sorts of submit buttons and reset buttons, submit buttons and reset buttons, and anchor tags all have default behaviors. And I think even though I put parentheses here, because it's a single parameter, you can get by without the parentheses. It'll still work. Right? That's actually the syntax that you're supposed to use. Oh, it says expected parentheses. Okay. All right. Never mind. Okay. This recording's at 1 hour and 7 minutes. That makes about 2.5 hours of lecture today plus. So we've covered a lot of material, like I said, in chapter 4. So we'll go ahead and stop the recording here.